I'm Karen from Bessie Pearl Textiles. Okay, let's talk about the supplies you'll need to make your bias tape. Obviously, you'll need your fabric. You also want to make sure you've got your rotary cutter and your cutting mat, some scissors, a quilting ruler. You'll also need your sewing machine and your iron. Step one is to cut off your selvage edge. It doesn't have to be exact, don't worry, but just go ahead, line up your ruler and cut it off. All right, step two, we're gonna take our corner and fold it down. So when I make bias tape, I always go the same direction just because it helps me make sure I'm doing it correctly. So I always start with my right corner and fold it down to the bottom edge to make a triangle. You don't want to fold all the way down to the other corner, but you do want to fold down to the bottom edge. And then you can either finger press it or use your iron to just press that down because we're going to be cutting along that line. All right, once you've ironed it or finger pressed it, you want to open that back up and then cut along that line that you have made. So this can be where everyone gets a little confused, but I promise it's easy. Take your fabric from the top, flip it over, continue to hold the bottom and just slide it down on top of your bottom piece. Okay, so here's your piece that you cut and flipped, and now we're gonna sew a seam right here from the top down to your bottom point. So you're just gonna lay it in there. I usually use about a 1/4 inch seam. I just kind of eyeball it. As long as it's the same all the way down, it doesn't matter. And then we're just gonna sew all the way down to our point. And clip it. All right, and now we're gonna go to our iron and press it. So now we're gonna press our seam open. I usually just start it with my fingers. One thing I have learned is with a bias seam, if you pull on the top a little bit against your iron, then you can just iron all the way up. So you don't need to get your fingers too close to the iron. Now that we've gotten our seam ironed, we're gonna lay this out on the cutting mat and fold it so it's a little bit easier to cut our strips. You can see it hangs off of my mat. So you could just go ahead and start cutting strips, but usually when you're using a larger piece of fabric, it's a lot easier to fold it up. So take your left side and fold it in. You want these bottom ones to line up. And then you're gonna take your other side and fold it in towards your middle seam as well, like that. So we are going to be cutting our strips off of this edge, so I will go ahead and turn it so it's easier for me to cut. If you look closely, you can now see that all of your threads run at an angle, which means that we are now cutting on the bias at the 45-degree angle. Grab your ruler and you want to straighten up your edge first, obviously. So I just line up my bottom fold with one of my marks here and then even it off on the side. So since we're making quilt binding today, I'm gonna go ahead and cut my strips at 2.5 inches. At this point, if you were making bias tape or you wanted a wider quilt binding, you can cut it however you want. But we're gonna make quilt binding, so I cut mine at 2.5 inches here. I'm gonna go ahead and cut my strip. Okay, so now I'm gonna go ahead and cut the rest of my piece, make more strips here. If you read to the bottom of the blog post, there's a little bit of math that will tell you how many yards you will need if you're making a quilt, so you would know how many strips you need to cut. So that might be helpful. But I'm gonna go ahead and cut the rest of my strips and use all my fabric, and then I'll show you how to attach them all together. Okay, let's go sew them together. So now we're gonna sew our strips together. Every time I sew my strips together, I lay them out in front of me to make sure I'm sewing the correct direction. This fabric is easy because it's printed on one side, but when you're using solids, it can be easy to get your sides confused and then your seams will go the wrong way and that's frustrating. So here's one strip, here's my next strip. Both of my angles are going the same way, and all I'm gonna do is flip this one over so that it matches up with that one. So I've just turned it over, and I want about 1/4 inch of extra on either side. So what we're going to do now is sew from this point to this point. So I just lay it in my machine. The biggest thing that's important is to make sure you sew directly between the points. That will give you a nice straight line when you open it up. So take your time if you need to. I usually want about 1/4 inch, but don't worry so much about how straight your seam is. Make sure you're going from point to point. So you'll see as we get down to the bottom, my edges aren't lining up, and that's okay. I want my seam to go from point to point and try and end right on that other point. There we go. So you can see when I pull it off and open it up, now I've got a nice straight line for my quilt binding. If your if your points don't line up, it'll be off right here. Okay, so I'm gonna do that again just so you can see how I make another continuous line. So I take the end of that strip, take my next strip, I wanna move that, whoop. These don't match up, my angles don't match up, so I'm just gonna trim this one. I'm just gonna cut it. Sometimes that happens. So now they're both going the same way. Don't worry too much about how straight it is, it's fine. All right, so then I'm gonna flip right sides together. Make sure I've got a little bit of extra hanging over there. And then I'm gonna sew again. And this is kind of just like strip piecing it all together. Right in between my points. I always slow down at the end so I know I'm going right through. Okay. Trim it like that. And again, then when you open it up, you've got a nice straight line. Okay. Once you've got all your strips sewn together, you want to just trim off your dog ears. Do trim them straight, otherwise it will you'll have kind of wonky binding. But you want to trim all your little dog ears off. So this one here, like that. So you've got a nice straight line. And now we're gonna go over to press it. We're making quilt binding. All we're gonna do is just fold it in half. If you were making double fold bias tape, at this point you would run it through your bias tape maker. So the first thing I wanna do is iron my seam. So I have a nice flat seam here. And then I'm just gonna fold it in half, match up my ends, and start ironing. One of the nice things about bias is since it has a little bit of stretch, you can kind of pull against the iron and that'll give you a nice straight line. So I'm kind of putting a little tension on my strip and that helps my edges line up a little bit nicer. So I just keep going. Once I get to my next seam, I just want to flatten it out with my fingers and then press it with my iron. And then same thing. So you notice I am moving I don't keep my fingers real close to the iron, but it's not getting too hot right now. There you go. So you just want to go all the way to the end and then you'll have all of your binding. Congrats, you've made your quilt binding. Ta-da! And now you're ready to attach it to your quilt. So happy sewing. Thanks for following along.